So today we're going to talk about my favorite lens for the Fujifilm X system. Alright guys, so welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby, photographer here in Seoul. I went outside to try and shoot this today, but it's a nice day outside and there's just so many people around, I couldn't get good audio, so I'm back here at home recording it. The new mic system is on the way, and so I'll be able to do a little bit more, an interesting background and kind of show you guys a bit of the city, but for now we're stuck with the Rode Video Micro, and Seoul being this kind of place, it's just impossible to record good audio. So here we are. Now, onto the topic at hand. We're going to talk today about my favorite lens for the Fujifilm system, and this is in no way kind of a recommendation, hey, go buy this lens. This is me telling you the lens that works best for me, and among the possibilities, why it's the best for me. So I mentioned in my previous video that purchasing a new lens or getting a new lens to use is something that has to be a very personal decision, because it has to be the right lens for the kind of photographs that you want to make, which is why I say this is not a buying guide. This is not me saying, hey, this is a great lens, you should go and get it. This is me saying it works for me and here's why. So without further ado, let's bring it in. This is the 35mm f1.4 from Fuji. It's one of the first lenses they released. In fact, it actually came out at the same time as the X Pro 1, so that'll give you a fair idea of how old this lens is and the sort of technology that's in it. As we know, over the years, Fuji has got a lot better with things like autofocus and just the overall build quality, but that's not to detract from this lens at all. Now, there's a lot of offerings in the sort of normal lens range, the 35mm 1.4, the f2 version of this lens, which has its weather resistance. There's also a 35mm 0.95, and there's a Zeiss 32mm f1.8 that I had way back. However, after using all of those, this is still my favorite. So before we get into why I chose this particular lens out of all the different normal lens offerings for the Fujifilm X system, I want to talk a little bit about why the normal lens, or the 50mm focal equivalent, works for me. Now this goes back to when I was shooting Nikon. When I was shooting Nikon film bodies, I would use a 50mm f1.4. After the release of the 58mm 1.4, I started using that on my D800 and on my D750, and for me that was the most comfortable focal length. I know how it renders the world. It just works for the way that I like to shoot. It doesn't distort in either direction. It doesn't give me that perspective distortion that you might get from a wide-angle lens, or not to any extreme, and it doesn't really zoom in and kill out a lot of the background that I might want to keep in my images. So it gives me a good versatile lens to work with, and that's why I love it so much. The other thing with 50mm lenses is they typically focus reasonably close. So you can go anywhere from a headshot to a full body shot and still get a good rendering from these lenses. So it makes them a very versatile lens for the type of documentary or family sessions that I typically do. The other great thing about 50mm lenses, or normal lenses, is they're typically very fast. f1.4, f2, those are fairly normal apertures for these lenses. So again, it makes it very, very versatile. I can go for a shallow depth of field, I can go for a deep depth of field, all with the one lens without having to change a thing, and still know exactly how it's going to render. So that's why personally I love this lens. Now, in amongst all of the different offerings for the Fujifilm system, you can see that the f2 version is weather resistant. The f9 0.95 gives you this amazing shallow depth of field and sort of beautiful swirly bokeh there. The Zeiss might be sharper in the corners. All of those things, in the end, didn't please me, and for various reasons. And in the end, I went back to the 35mm 1.4, which I had from the very beginning of owning the Fujifilm system. Now the f2, it's a great lens. It's fast to focus. It's got weather resistance, so it pairs very well with things like the X-T2 and the X-H1, where you can just guarantee that it's going to survive a storm. That's fantastic. But I didn't really enjoy the image quality of that lens. It felt a little too perfect. That sounds a little strange, but it felt a little too perfect for me. Things rendered simply, kind of in a boring way. Whereas with the 35 1.4, I find that especially the transition between sort of in focus and out of focus, it's a little more interesting, it's a little softer, it's a little it has a good feeling to it. The backgrounds at f1.4, they go a little bit more blurry. You get a little bit of that bokeh swirl going around. That sort of stuff pleases me, and so I really love the 35mm 1.4. The other thing with it is, it flares a lot more than the f2 version. It ghosts a lot more than the f2 version. If you point this thing into the sun, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to see a few artifacts in the image. And I love the ability to use those when I want them. So I love this ability to be able to choose if I want to put the sun in my frame and allow it to get this big halo around it and have some flare coming across the frame. I love the ability to pick and choose when I want that, especially if you take that hood off. You're going to see that a lot. The f2 version, it corrects for all that stuff a lot more effectively, and so it doesn't have that character that the f1.4 lens has. Zeiss's lens has a similar effect. It tends to quash all of those interesting little details that the f1.4 produces. If you want to go to extremes with those sorts of things, you can go for that f0.95 lens. That flares and has these giant red circles and all of these things, but again, I found myself not liking that lens because what I typically shoot is moving quite quickly, and it made it difficult to get things in focus, having to manual focus with that rather stiff ring. And so, in the end, the 35mm 1.4 was the lens for me. Of course, this lens is far from perfect. The autofocus still isn't as fast as some of the newer lenses, despite it having improved significantly. If anybody has owned the X Pro 1 with this lens, you'll know about autofocus. You can wait a good second for this lens to go in and out and finally catch on to something. However, on the newer bodies, the X-T2, the XH1, it's fine. It's up to par with, with everything I need. Sure, there are faster lenses, but it does what I need it to do. Things that I would love to see improved on this. Let me grab it again. I would love to see this aperture ring replaced with one of the newer ones. This is a little bit too easy to turn, and I find myself, when I put it in my bag and take it out again, it tends to have turned a little bit, or if I knock it on myself, it will turn the aperture. I would prefer one of the newer, stiffer aperture rings that Fujifilm has been including. The other thing that really bugs me, and it's not so much about weather sealing as it is about this little center barrel of the lens telescopes in and out during focus. Now, if that were internal, I wouldn't have to worry about additional dust or water if I'm outside getting in between the barrels of the lens. And so that I would really like to see an internal focus, possibly the faster focusing motors from the newer lenses as well, and a newer aperture ring on this thing. And Fuji, if you happen to still be considering producing that 33mm 1.0, please. I know there's a lot of people out there who'd love a lens like that, and honestly, that's maybe those two things, really improving this to a second version, or the 33mm 1.0, are the only real reasons I might consider replacing this lens. Right, so there we go, guys. That's why I love the 35mm 1.4. If you don't, leave a comment below. If you do, leave a comment below. Let us know what your favorite normal lens is. Let's start a conversation. Let's see why we love these lenses so much. Or, if you don't prefer this focal length, what is your favorite? Why do you like that so much? Thanks again for tuning into the channel. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you'd like to see more of this. We'll have more every Wednesday. Thanks again, guys.